My name is Lisa Duke. I am 28 years old and a captain in the United States Army. That night, the wind was screaming at 60 miles per hour, ripping street signs off their posts on Maple Ridge Road. But the thing that turned my blood to ice wasn't Storm Moran. It was the rhythmic metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place right behind me. I was standing barefoot, sinking into the freezing mud, my t-shirt soaked and clinging to my skin like a second layer of grief. Through the window, I looked straight into the living room. Roy, the stepfather who had just finished stealing $83,400 of my father's death benefits, calmly cracked open a lukewarm beer. Right next to him, my own mother reached up and yanked the curtains shut. She closed the blinds on the very house my father built. She chose to lock her own daughter out in a hurricane to protect a parasite. They thought I would scream. They thought I would beg for a key. They were wrong. Before I show you how I burned their world down, hit like, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from. I read every comment. Now, let me tell you why the blade from your own family always cuts the deepest. 15 minutes earlier, the air inside the house tasted like stale grease and cowardice. I sat at the small kitchen table, my back as straight as a structural beam. It was a habit from the academy that Roy hated. He liked people slouched. He liked them small. Across from me, Roy Lester was shoveling a pile of instant mashed potatoes into his mouth. His flannel sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms stained with the gray grime of a job site he probably hadn't visited in weeks. He didn't look up. He didn't have to. In this house, silence was his favorite weapon. On the wall, a small television hummed. The weather map was a bruised smear of deep reds and purples. Storm Moran was making landfall, and the wind was already beginning to rattle the window panes. Beside Roy, my mother Diane was staring intensely at her plate. She was moving a single pea around with her fork, her eyes fixed on the ceramic surface as if it held the secrets to her survival. I placed my stainless steel fork down. It hit the porcelain plate with a sharp, clinical ring that cut through the TV's static. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. A captain doesn't need to shout to be heard. $83,400, Roy, I said. My voice was a flat, even line. My father's life insurance, the payout for his 20 years of service. The money meant for me. Where is it? The room went dead. The only sound was the wind buffeting the siding. Roy stopped chewing. He took his time. He licked a smear of butter off his thumb and leaned back the cheap wooden chair, groaning under his weight. He reached for a Budweiser on the table, the aluminum tab snapping with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the tiny kitchen. "You've got a lot of nerve, Lisa." Roy muttered, his voice thick with unearned authority. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try to hide the theft. He pointed a greasy finger at the walls around us. "That money kept this roof over your head while you were off playing soldier. It kept the lights on. It kept your mother from the street. You owe this house. You don't get to come back here after years in the sand and start auditing the books." "It was my father's money," I replied. My pulse stayed at 60 beats per minute, combat breathing, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. It was his final gift to make sure I had a future. "You didn't use it for the roof, Roy. You used it to pay off your gambling debts and buy that F-150 sitting in the driveway. You stole from a dead man." Roy's face turned a mottled shade of red. He slammed his palm onto the table, making the silverware dance. "I'm the man of this house," he roared. He stood up, towering over the table, trying to use his bulk to shadow me. "You don't talk to me like that. Not in here." I looked at my mother. I waited for her to say something, to look up, to be the woman who used to tuck me in and tell me that the world was a fair place. "Mom, Diane Duke." Lester didn't move. She didn't look at me. She just pushed her chair back, the legs screeching against the linoleum. She stood up with her head down, walked over to the front door, and began unlooping the heavy iron chain. Roy hasted a thumb toward the porch. "Out, right now. When you learn how to keep your mouth shut and show some respect to the people who raised you, maybe we'll let you back in for breakfast. Move." I stood up. I didn't rush. I didn't cry. I walked toward the door. As I passed my mother, I caught the scent of her lavender soap, the same smell from my childhood. It felt like a betrayal in every nostril. She was trembling, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. She was choosing the monster who stole my inheritance over the daughter who had bled for her country. The moment I stepped onto the porch, the wind hit me like a physical wall. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the front yard into a swamp of black mud. I heard the door slam. I heard the deadbolt slide. The heavy iron chain rattled into place. I stood there for a long time. My toes sank into the cold muck. My thin t-shirt was translucent within seconds. The cold was a dull ache, but the rage inside me was a white, hot coal. I turned my head and looked at the wooden fence bordering the property. Under the relentless assault of the rain, the cheap, thin white paint Roy had slapped on years ago was beginning to peel and wash away in long, ugly strips. Underneath it, a deep, dark shade began to emerge. Harbor blue. It was the color my father had picked. The color he had painted with his own hands before he died. Roy had tried to erase him. He had tried to whitewash our entire history. But the storm was doing what I should have done years ago. It was stripping away the lies. I stared at that blue wood. Every invasion begins with a single point of entry. This was mine. I checked my watch. 11 minutes until the first move of the counteroffensive. They thought I was a victim. They forgot I was a strategist. The rain tasted like iron. The war had officially come home. I looked at that sliver of harbor blue wood under the pouring rain, and 16 years of suppressed memories came flooding back like a broken levee. Back to the day the garage stopped smelling like my father. It happened exactly 14 months after we buried Nathan Duke. He was an electrician who worked with his hands until the skin was thick as glove leather, but those hands always felt warm when they ruffled my hair. The garage was his sanctuary. It was a place that breathed machine oil, fresh cedar sawdust, and the sharp metallic tang of copper wire. It was a place of order and purpose. Then Roy Lester pulled into our lives in a rusted-out flatbed truck, and the air turned sour. Roy didn't ask for permission. He didn't sit us down for a talk about new beginnings. He just walked into that garage, kicked my father's organized bins of brass screws aside, and cracked open a 5-gallon bucket of cheap, blindingly white exterior paint. I watched him from the doorway, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. Roy didn't even look at me. He just dipped a heavy, shaggy roller into the tray and swept it across the wooden fence. One stroke. The harbor blue. The deep coastal color my dad had spent 3 weekends perfect was gone, smothered under a layer of chalky white death. Roy's movements were slow and deliberate. He wasn't fixing the house. He was performing an execution. He was erasing the man who built this home 1 square foot at a time. The invasion didn't stop at the fence. It was a systematic purge of everything Nathan Duke had ever touched. Roy moved through our hallway like a conqueror clearing out a defeated village. He took down the photos, the one of my dad holding me at the county fair, the one of their wedding day. He didn't put them in boxes or tuck them away for safekeeping. He tossed them into heavy black trash bags as if they were nothing but old coffee grounds and eggshells. Then came my bedroom. It was the only room in the house that caught the full morning sun. Roy decided he needed a space for his business ventures. He moved my bed to the dark, damp corner of the basement and filled my old sanctuary with rusted pipe wrenches, oil-stained rags, and the constant heavy smell of stale cigarettes. He even cut the cord to the outside world. One afternoon, I came home from school to find the landline phone ripped out of the wall. Roy told me the bill was too high and we had to tighten our belts. The truth was much uglier. That phone was my only line to my Grandma Vivian. He wanted me isolated. He wanted me to forget there was a world where someone actually gave a damn about the Duke name. I tried to fight back once. I stood at the top of the stairs while Roy hauled my father's favorite armchair, the one with the worn velvet where we used to read together, out to the curb for the garbage truck to take away. My mother appeared beside me, but she didn't put an arm around my shoulder. She just shoved a glass of cold milk into my hand. The glass was sweating in the summer heat, and the milk tasted like nothing but cold chalk. Don't make a scene, Lisa, she whispered. Her eyes were fixed on the hallway carpet, tracking a loose thread she didn't have the courage to pull. Roy is just trying to do what's best for the family. We have to move on. He's the one providing for us now. Just drink your milk and go downstairs. Her cowardice was a slow-acting poison. She watched him tear my father's soul out of the drywall and called it moving on. Every time she handed me a snack or a drink to keep me quiet, I felt another part of my love for her shrivel up. I learned to be a ghost. I spent my nights in the basement, curled in the back corner of an old oak wardrobe that still held the faint, fading scent of my father's work jacket. That's where I kept it. The only thing Roy hadn't managed to find and destroy. The pocket watch. It was a heavy piece of silver. The glass face was cracked from the day my father fell, but the internal gears were stubborn. I reached into the dark, pulled it out, and gripped the winding stem between my thumb and forefinger. Kirk, Kirk, Kirk. The sound was sharp and dry. It was the only sound in that house that Roy Lester didn't own. I pressed the cold metal against my ear. The steady rhythmic tick-tock was a drumbeat, a march, 832 days. That's how long it would be until I turned 18. That's how many days I had to survive this whitewashed prison before I could sign the enlistment papers and disappear into the army. I wasn't just waiting. I was training. I learned to breathe through the anger. I learned to watch Roy's patterns. I learned that every tyrant has a weakness and every invasion has a cost. I know some of you listening right now have been there. You felt that suffocating weight of being silenced in your own home by someone who didn't belong there. If you've ever had to count the days until you were finally free, please support the channel by hitting that like button and drop a 1 in the comments. Let me know I'm not the only one who had to fight just to keep their own name. I sat there in the basement dark, the watch ticking against my skull. The white paint was drying upstairs, but underneath it, the blue was waiting. Roy Lester thought he had won. He thought he had buried the memory of Nathan Duke under a layer of cheap hardware store chemicals. He was wrong. I felt a cold, hard resolve settle into my marrow. The countdown was running, and one day, I was going to be the one holding the paint roller. I was going to strip away every lie he ever told. I closed my eyes and listened to the rain. The storm was coming even back then. The ticking stopped. The mainspring was tight. Now it was time to find out what Roy was hiding in that locked cabinet of his. The house tasted different when Roy Lester wasn't in it. It still stank of his existence, that sour, heavy mix of stale tobacco, unwashed flannel, and cheap beer. But the air didn't vibrate with his temper. He had taken his Ford F-150 to a dive bar 3 miles out, likely looking for a game of poker he could afford to lose with my father's money. I stood in the dim hallway, my back straight, eyes scanning for any sign of a trap. I wasn't a daughter coming home for a visit. I was an operative in a hostile environment. I reached the door to the storage room. It used to be my bedroom. Now it was a dumping ground for Roy's half-baked projects and stolen space. The door was locked. A cheap brass deadbolt that Roy thought would keep the world out. He was wrong. Roy underestimated the training they give you at Fort Bragg. They teach you how to break things. They teach you how to enter places where you aren't invited. I pulled a thin, high-tensile metal shim from the pocket of my tactical trousers. My hands were steady. No tremors, no hesitation. I slipped the metal into the gap between the frame and the bolt. I didn't use force. I used leverage. 3 seconds of focused pressure. A dry metallic click echoed in the empty hallway. The door gave way. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. The room was cold. It smelled of rusted iron and dry rot. Roy had piled his junk everywhere, half-empty cans of varnish tangled copper wire he'd stripped from job sites, and boxes of tools he didn't know how to use. I flicked on my tactical flashlight. The beam was a sharp, piercing circle of white light that cut through the shadows. Under the glare, the dust motes danced like tiny silver insects caught in a web. I went straight for the heavy oak cabinet in the corner. It was a piece of furniture my father had built in his garage back when the house still smelled like cedar and motor oil. Roy had dragged it in here to hold his records. I dropped to my knees, my joints silent. I didn't look in the drawers. Roy was too lazy for organized filing. I reached into the dark space beneath the cabinet, my fingers brushing against the cold grit-covered floorboards. My knuckles hit cardboard. I pulled. A battered shoebox slid out from the shadows. It had no lid. The top layer was covered in a fine gray shroud of dust. I didn't sneeze. I didn't move fast. I reached in and pulled out a stack of papers. The paper felt dry and coarse against my calloused fingertips. I recognized the logo immediately, a blue shield, the insurance company my father had paid into for 20 years of his life. I flipped through the pages. The flashlight beam stayed locked on the text. There it was, sole beneficiary, Lisa Duke. My father had made sure I was looked after. He had left me a safety net, $83,400 meant to be my bridge back to civilian life. But the ledger told a different story. The withdrawals started 5 years ago, right after I deployed to the base in the north. While I was sitting in a hole in the sand eating gray meat out of a foil pouch and listening for the whistle of incoming mortars, Roy Lester was at a bank branch on Main Street. He was bleeding my father's legacy dry, 1,000 here, 5,000 there. A massive chunk taken out right before he bought that truck. The rage started in my gut as slow pressurized heat, but I kept it under a steel lid. Then I saw the second knife, the blow that actually drew blood. On the bottom of the third withdrawal authorization, there was a signature line. It wasn't Roy's blocky, jagged scrawl. It was a series of elegant slanted loops. Perfect cursive. Diane Duke Lester. My mother. Her signature didn't shake. There were no hesitation marks. She hadn't been forced. She had signed my future away with the same hand that used to hold mine when I was afraid of the dark. She had watched me pack my bags for a war zone, kissed my cheek, and then went to the bank to help a parasite spend my blood money. They didn't just steal the cash, they stole the only thing my father had left me, his protection. I didn't scream. I didn't tear the papers. I pulled my phone from my pocket and snapped high-resolution photos of every page, every signature, every date. My hands were as cold as the floorboards. When I was done, I folded the papers back into their original creases. I placed the stack back into the shoebox and slid it under the cabinet. I stopped. I checked the alignment. I moved the box exactly 2 centimeters to the left, matching the faint tracks in the dust where it had originally sat. No evidence of intrusion. No sign that the prey had seen the trap. I stood up, wiped the dust from my knees, and backed out of the room. I locked the deadbolt and walked back to the kitchen. I sat in my chair and waited for the storm to break. I waited for that dinner where Roy would finally show his hand. Now the memory of that shoebox was the only thing keeping my heart beating under the freezing rain. I am still standing on the lawn of the house my father built, my feet sinking into the black mud of Maple Ridge. The storm is screaming in my ears, and my mother's betrayal is a stone in my throat. My skin is turning a pale, sickly blue, and I can feel the strength leaving my legs. I thought I was done. I thought the mud would be my final bed. Then a sudden violent flash of light X-rayed through the falling rain. A pair of high-end xenon headlights, bright yellow and predatory, cut through the blackness of the storm. A massive engine roared, drowning out the wind as a heavy car accelerated up the driveway, its tires spitting gravel and slush. The lights were so bright I couldn't see the driver. All I could see was the reflection of the beams in the floodwater. The war wasn't over. The cavalry had just arrived. These xenon headlights were predatory twin beams of surgical yellow light that X-rayed the falling rain. A heavy black Lincoln Town car sliced through the flooded gutter of Maple Ridge Road, its tires throwing up a wall of dirty gray slush as it screeched to a halt at the edge of the driveway. The engine didn't sputter or whine. It hummed with the expensive, low-frequency vibration of a well-maintained machine. The rear passenger window rolled down exactly 2 inches. Inside, I caught a glimpse of silver hair and a slash of deep, blood-red lipstick. Vivian Duke. She was 73 years old, and she looked like she was carved out of cold Atlantic granite. She didn't look at me first. Her gaze was a laser locking onto the slight panicked twitch of the living room curtains where Roy Lester was peeping out from the dark. She didn't yell. She didn't have to. She just smirked a sharp clinical expression that promised nothing but pain. "Pick up the girl," she said, her voice dropping into a low, gravelly rasp that cut through the thunder. The driver's door swung open. A man in a dark suit stepped out, ignored the rain, and hauled me off the muddy lawn. I didn't climb into the car. I was deposited into the back seat like a piece of salvaged cargo. The door thudded shut with a heavy pressurized seal that silenced the screaming wind of Storm Moran instantly. The interior was a different universe. It was thick with the scent of expensive almond lotion and the dry mechanical warmth of a high-end climate control system. My feet were bare and caked in black muck. My toes were raw, leaving smeared red stains on the deep velvet floor mats that probably cost more than Roy's truck. I was shivering so hard my teeth felt like they were going to shatter. Vivian didn't offer a hug. She didn't offer a, "Thank God you're okay." She just tossed a heavy white cotton towel at my head. It was bone dry and smelled like fresh laundry and old money. 14 years. Vivian said, her eyes never leaving the house as the Lincoln began to back out of the driveway. "I have spent 14 years waiting for that grease monkey to make a mistake this monumentally stupid. I have spent 14 years waiting for the legal right to rip you out of that cage, Lisa." "He took everything," I whispered. My voice was a shredded wreck. "The insurance, the house, everything. He took nothing but a loan he can't repay." Vivian countered, her voice as sharp as a bayonet. "Dry yourself off. We have work to do." We didn't go to a hospital. We didn't go to her estate in the hills. The Lincoln pulled into the underground valet of the Regency Hotel. We took the private elevator to the 7th floor suite 714. I stood on the polished white marble of the entryway, my wet clothes dripping a puddle onto the floor, while Vivian marched to a glass-topped desk. She moved with a speed that defied her age, a woman who had spent half a century running a real estate empire with an iron fist. She reached into a leather briefcase and slammed a gold-trimmed manila folder onto the glass desk. The sound was a loud, dry crack that echoed in the silent suite. "Sit," she ordered. I sat in a chair that felt like a cloud, my skin still crawling with the phantom sensation of freezing rain. Vivian tapped the folder. "Twist number 1. She said, her red lips curving into a predatory line. "The house on Maple Ridge. The one Roy thinks is his fortress. It was never Diane's to give away. Your father, Nathan, knew exactly what kind of woman your mother was. He didn't leave her the deed. He put that property into the Duke family trust." She flipped a page, revealing a document with my father's signature at the bottom. "Your mother was a tenant with one single ironclad condition for her residency." Vivian explained, her finger tracing a line of legalese. She was never to engage in any conduct that endangered the primary beneficiary. "That's you, Lisa." Tonight she locked a combat veteran out in a Category 4 hurricane to protect a parasite. She didn't just lock the door, she signed her own eviction notice. The warmth of the room was finally reaching my marrow, but it was the cold realization in Vivian's eyes that truly woke me up. "Roy Lester is a thief. Diane is a coward," Vivian said, leaning over the desk until her face was inches from mine. "They think they've won. They think the Duke legacy is something they can sell off for parts to pay for a Ford F-150 and a gambling habit. They are about to find out that this family has very long memories and very sharp teeth." She stood up and crossed her arms over her chest. "I have the money to bury them in court for a decade, Lisa. I have the lawyers to make sure Roy Lester never holds a hammer again. But I'm not going to lead this charge." She paused, her eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. "I want you to lead the counteroffensive. I want you to take command of this operation and strip them of everything they've stolen. I want you to be the one who hands them the boxes." I looked at the folder. I looked at the red smear of blood on my foot. The girl who had begged for her mother's help was gone, drowned in the mud of Maple Ridge. The captain was back. "Roger that," I said, my voice finally steady. Vivian nodded once, a crisp military gesture of approval. "Good. Get some sleep. Tomorrow morning we meet with Calloway, and by noon, the war starts." I stood up. the towel draped over my shoulders like a cape. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was hunting. Monday morning, downtown. The air in Calloway's office didn't smell like a brewing hurricane or stale lukewarm beer. It smelled like expensive roasted beans and the sharp ozone scent of a fresh laser printer. It smelled like the law. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, my spine a rigid line of military-grade discipline. I didn't lean back. I didn't fidget. I watched Calloway through the dust motes dancing in the morning light. He looked like a man who had spent 40 years chewing on brick and washing it down with vinegar, blunt gray and completely unimpressed by Roy Lester's existence. Calloway adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, the metal clicking against his temple. He didn't waste time with small talk. He reached for a stack of 3 manila folders on his mahogany desk and slid them toward me one by one. The sound of paper on wood was a series of dry, rhythmic thuds. Folder 1. Calloway began, his voice a gravelly rasp. The Duke Family Trust. Your father, Nathan, was a smart man, Captain. He built a fortress around that property that even a tank couldn't breach. It stays with you. Period. Folder 2. He continued, tapping the middle file. The insurance records. The $83,400. Roy and your mother treated that account like a personal ATM while you were over there eating sand in a bunker. They've bled it nearly dry. We can sue for it, but Roy's the kind of rat who hides his cheese well. It'll take time. Then he reached for the third folder. It was thinner than the others. It bore the blue and white logo of a local credit union. Calloway's fingers lingered on the edge of the paper. Roy Lester isn't just a parasite, Lisa, Calloway said. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. He's an idiot, a greedy, arrogant idiot who thought the rules didn't apply to him because nobody ever had the spine to say no. He flipped the folder open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a mortgage application dated 18 months ago. Roy had tried to pull a $35,000 home equity loan out of the Maple Ridge house. He'd listed himself as the primary owner. He was looking for a quick score, a way to pay off a gambling debt or upgrade that F-150 he loved more than his own family. Calloway pulled a heavy magnifying glass from his desk drawer and slid it across the surface. Look at the signature line, Captain. Bottom right, under the borrower's name. I leaned forward. I knew my mother's handwriting. Diane's signature was a series of soft slanted loops, a feminine hesitant script that always seemed to be apologizing for taking up space on the page. But this was different. The ink was pressed deep into the paper, the lines rigid and jagged. It was a calculated, stiff imitation. Someone had tried too hard to be precise, and in doing so, they'd left a trail of lead. That's not her, I said. My voice was a flat, cold edge. Not even close. Calloway agreed. He leaned back his chair, groaning under the weight of his professional satisfaction. Roy Lester forged your mother's name to secure a loan on a property he didn't own. In the state of Missouri, that's not just a family squabble. That's mortgage fraud. It's identity theft. It's a Class C felony. Roy Lester didn't just steal your money, Lisa. He committed a federal crime. The silence in the office was absolute. Outside, the city was waking up, but in here, the air felt pressurized. In the Army, I'd seen men destroyed for far less. A sergeant once lost a rifle bolt and was demoted before the sun went down. A private had falsified a duty log and spent the next year in the brig. Discipline was the only thing that kept the world from dissolving into chaos. Roy Lester had spent 16 years laughing at discipline. He'd spent 16 years treating my father's house like a personal playground because he thought he was the loudest predator in the woods. He was about to find out that there's always a bigger predator. And this one had a law degree. So what's the play? I asked. I didn't smirk. I didn't smile. I just watched the ink on the paper. You have 2 buttons on this desk. Captain Calloway said, his eyes locking onto mine with a predatory intensity. Button 1, civil court. We evict them. We sue for the insurance money. We take the truck, the tools, and the shirt off Roy's back. We leave them on the curb with a couple of suitcases and let them rot in a cheap motel. It's clean. It's fast. But Roy stays a free man. He paused, letting the weight of the second option hang in the air. Button 2. We take folder 3 to the district attorney's office. We let them know about the forgery. We let them know Roy Lester used a dead man's trust to defraud a federal credit union. Roy doesn't go to a motel. Roy goes to a 5x8 cell for the next 5 years, minimum. And Diane, as an accomplice who didn't report the crime, she'll be lucky if she avoids a suspended sentence. I looked at the forged signature. I felt a cold, jagged thrill in my marrow. For 16 years, I had been the one under the heel. I was the child hiding in the wardrobe, winding a broken watch to keep from screaming. Now I was the one holding the hammer. I was the one who got to decide if Roy Lester spent the next half-decade in an orange jumpsuit, eating lukewarm mush and sleeping on a steel bunk. I reached out my fingers, hovering over the folders. I was a strategist. I was a soldier. I didn't make moves based on anger. I made them based on results. Before I could speak, the silence was shattered. My phone lying flat on the mahogany desk began to vibrate with a violent rhythmic buzz that made the wood hum. I didn't pick it up. I just looked at the screen. A single name was pulsing in the dim light of the office over and over. Mom. The enemy was panicking. The first breach in their perimeter had been detected, and now they were calling for a truce that I wasn't interested in giving. Calloway looked at the phone, then at me. He didn't say a word. He just waited. I let it ring. I let the vibration fill the room until it died out into a heavy, expectant silence. Then I looked at Calloway and reached for the third folder. Let's talk about button 2, I said. I chose a diner 20 miles outside of town, a place where the air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee beans and the heavy lingering grease of 1,000 low-budget breakfasts. I sat in a corner booth, the scuffed red vinyl cold against my skin. I didn't order food. I just watched the front door, my back flat against the wall, my eyes tracking every movement in the parking lot. In the Army, you learn that the most dangerous threats don't always come from the front line. Sometimes they come from the people who are supposed to hold the perimeter while you sleep. Diane walked in 10 minutes late. She looked like she was being hunted. She kept her beige trench coat buttoned up to her chin, her hands buried deep in her pockets, and her eyes darting between the booths as if she expected an ambush. She didn't look like a mother meeting her daughter. She looked like a witness about to flip on a mob boss. She slid into the seat across from me, the legs of her chair screeching against the tile floor. She didn't take off her coat. She didn't reach across the table to touch my hand. She didn't even ask if I had caught a fever after standing barefoot in a hurricane while she watched from the dry side of the glass. The first thing out of her mouth wasn't an apology. It was a complaint. Roy is a wreck, Lisa. He's losing his mind over that eviction notice. She said, her voice a thin, shaky rasp. She finally looked at me, but her eyes were bloodshot and hollow. What are you doing? What is all this legal talk? You're tearing this family apart. I didn't blink. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the folded photocopy of the mortgage application. I slid it across the table. The paper made a dry, sliding sound against the formica. He forged your name, Mom, I said. My voice was a flat, clinical line. He used the house my father built for us, as collateral for a $35,000 loan he had no right to take. He stole my identity, and then he stole yours. Did you know? Diane looked at the paper. She didn't gasp. She didn't act surprised. She just stared at the jagged, stiff imitation of her own signature and then let her shoulders slump. Her eyes dropped back to the table, focusing on a coffee stain near the sugar shaker. She knew. She had always known. Roy needed that truck for work. Lisa, she whispered, her voice cracking. He said it was an investment for our future. He said once he got the new contracts, he'd pay it all back. He's just trying to provide for us. By stealing from me? I asked. I felt a wave of cold, hard disgust rise in my throat, thick as silt. By taking the money Dad left to make sure I was safe. By forging your name and risking your credit, your home, your life. He's a criminal, Mom, and you're helping him. Diane finally reached out her fingers, trembling as she tried to grab my wrist. I pulled my arm back, my movement sharp and automatic. I didn't want her touch. It felt like grease. You have money, Lisa. You have your army salary and your pension. She hissed, her desperation finally turning into a twisted kind of anger. If you kick him out, I have nothing. I don't have a job. I don't have a place to go. You're my daughter. You're supposed to take care of me. I leaned forward until my face was inches from hers. I wanted her to see the ice in my eyes. I wanted her to feel the 11 minutes of rain that were still freezing my marrow. I was your daughter on Maple Ridge Road too, I said. My words were low, aimed right at her heart. I was your daughter when the wind was ripping the trees out of the ground. I was your daughter when Roy turned that deadbolt. You stood right there, Mom. You watched him lock me out. Why did you choose him over your own blood? Diane stood up so fast her chair almost tipped over. The mask of the worried mother fell away, leaving nothing but a bitter, hollow woman who had traded her soul for the comfort of a lie. Her eyes turned hard and her mouth twisted into a snarl I had never seen before. Because he's my husband. She snapped, her voice loud enough to make the guy at the counter look over. And you're just like your father, stubborn, arrogant, ungrateful. Nathan thought he was better than everyone else too. Always acting like the world was black and white. Well, it's not, Lisa. It's gray and it's ugly, and you're going to end up just like him, alone in the dirt. She didn't wait for a reply. She turned on her heels, the sharp rhythmic clack of her shoes echoing like a drum beat as she marched out the door. She didn't look back. She didn't check to see if I was crying. She just vanished into the gray morning light, leaving me with a cold cup of coffee and the final crushing realization that there was nothing left to save. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty seat across from me. I pulled my father's pocket watch from my pocket and held it against my ear. Kirk, Kirk, Kirk. The gears were steady. My heart was steady. The last thread had been cut. The enemy had fired their final shot, and it was a dud. I know a lot of you listening have a Diane in your life, someone who demands your loyalty while they're busy handing you over to the wolves. If you've ever had to realize that your home was actually a cage, hit that like button and subscribe for the next chapter. And do me a favor, drop a 0 in the comments if you've ever had to walk away from a toxic family member to save your own life. I want to know I'm not standing here alone. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My thumb hovered over Calloway's number for half a second before I pressed dial. He picked up on the first ring. Calloway, I said. My voice was as cold as the steel in my father's garage. The peace talks are over. Send the filings to the court. Send the evidence to the DA. Open fire. I hung up, dropped a $5 bill on the table for the coffee I didn't drink, and walked out into the cold. The storm was over, but the landslide was just beginning. Thursday morning at 7:02 a.m. The air on Maple Ridge was raw, a biting cold that promised a hard winter after the storm. Sheriff Deputy Davis didn't get out of his cruiser with a smile. He didn't even look at the house. He walked straight to the front door, his boots crunching on the gravel, and pulled a heavy-duty staple gun from his belt. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound was sharp, like a bone snapping in the quiet morning. He slapped a bright orange sheet of paper onto the wood of the door, right over the spot where the paint was still peeling. He turned and walked away without a word. 10 seconds later, the front door ripped open. Roy Lester stood there in his undershirt, his face a mottled, angry red, clutching the orange paper like it was a live snake. "Lisa, you bitch!" he screamed into the empty street. I watched him from the back seat of the Lincoln parked 2 houses down. My grandmother Vivian sat beside me, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She just adjusted the silver cuff on her wrist. Roy didn't see us. He turned, sprinted back inside, and less than a minute later, he was backing his Ford F-150 down the driveway, the tires screaming as he fishtailed onto the asphalt. He was driving like a man with a ghost on his heels, heading straight for downtown. 15 minutes later, the valet at the Regency Hotel had to jump out of the way as Roy's truck skidded into the curb. Roy didn't wait for a ticket. He didn't care about the grease stains he was leaving on the marble entrance. He looked like a man unraveling hair uncombed, smelling of sour sweat and stale cigarettes. His flannel shirt hanging open over a gut fueled by beer and self-pity. He pushed past the security guard at the elevators and pounded the button for the 7th floor until his knuckles turned white. I was already in the suite with Vivian. The room was a sanctuary of white linen high ceilings and the sharp cold scent of Chanel No. 5. It was a world Roy Lester had no business being in. Vivian was sitting at the glass-top table, a cup of black coffee in front of her. She looked like a judge waiting for a guilty plea. Bang, bang, bang! The door to suite 714 nearly shook on its hinges. Roy wasn't knocking. He was trying to break the wood with his fists. Vivian didn't get up. She didn't even put down her cup. She just nodded to the security guard standing by the door. The heavy oak swung open, and Roy Lester stumbled in, gasping for air, clutching the orange eviction notice in his trembling hand. "You can't do this!" Roy roared, his voice cracking with a mix of rage and genuine terror. He ignored the guard. He ignored me standing in the corner shadows. He went straight for Vivian, pointing a shaking finger at her face. "I've lived in that house for 16 years. I'm the one who fixed the hot water heater. I'm the one who replaced the roof shingles after the hailstorm in 22. I'm the one who paid the property taxes." Vivian took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. She set the cup down with a soft, clinical clink. "You're a squatter, Roy," she said. Her voice was a low, frozen rasp. "A common thief who has overstayed his welcome by a decade and a half." "I have rights," Roy screamed, his face inches from hers. He was spitting as he spoke, his eyes wild with the desperation of a cornered animal. "It's called adverse possession. I've been the one maintaining that property under Missouri law. That house is as much mine as anyone's. You think you can just slap an orange sticker on my door and throw me to the curb? I'll sue you into the dirt." Vivian finally looked at him. Truly looked at him. It was the look a hawk gives a mouse before the talons close. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You paid the taxes, Roy?" she asked, her eyebrows arching. "You paid them with the insurance money you stole from my granddaughter. You repaired the roof with funds you embezzled from a dead man's estate. You don't have rights, Roy. You have a ledger of debt that you can never settle." She reached into a gold-trimmed leather envelope on the table and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cream-colored paper. The original deed. The one Nathan Duke signed with his own hand before the military sent him home in a box. She stood up, walked around the table, and slammed the paper into Roy's chest with a force that made him stagger back. "That is the deed," she hissed, her voice sharp as a razor. "It bears the Duke name, not yours. You mortgaged the property with a forged signature. You committed a Class C felony against a federal credit union. Listen to me, you parasite. You have 14 days to pack your garbage and vanish. If I see your truck on that driveway on the 15th day, this deed goes to the district attorney along with a signed confession from the loan officer you bribed. You won't be looking for a new house. You'll be looking for a lawyer who can handle a 5-year sentence." Roy's face went from red to a sickly translucent white. The orange paper slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the plush carpet. He looked at the deed in his hand like it was a death warrant. He looked at me standing in the shadows, and for the first time in my life, I saw the fear in his eyes. He wasn't the man of the house anymore. He was a con man who had run out of lies. He didn't say another word. He turned his boots, scuffing the carpet, and practically ran for the door. I watched the elevator lights count down as he descended. Vivian sat back down and picked up her coffee. "He's a coward, Lisa. He'll run." "He's not running yet," I replied, watching my phone buzz on the table. Late that night, the phone rang again. It was Calloway. I could hear the sound of paper shuffling on his end, and then a low, dry chuckle. "Captain, we heroes use," Calloway said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Roy just showed his hand. His lawyer just filed an emergency motion for a stay of execution. He's claiming he has nowhere to go, and that we're causing irreparable harm to his family." I gripped the phone, my knuckles white. "What now?" "Now," Calloway said, and I could practically see his smirk through the line. "Now we let him walk right into the trap. See you at the courthouse on Monday. It's time for the final hearing. I hung up and looked out at the city lights. Roy Lester was still fighting. He didn't realize he was already dead. Monday morning in courtroom B did not feel like the movies. There were no soaring wooden arches or majestic statues. It was a box of cinder blocks and cheap drywall bathed in the hum of flickering fluorescent lights that made everyone look like they were already dead. The air smelled of industrial floor wax and old coffee. It was cold. A clinical, unforgiving cold that seeped into your joints and stayed there. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my back a rigid vertical line. I was wearing my Class A uniform. Every button was polished to a mirror finish. Every crease was sharp enough to draw blood. I was not there as a daughter. I was there as a captain of the United States Army reclaiming a stolen fortress. On my left wrist, the heavy silver weight of my father's pocket watch felt like an anchor. It was not just a timepiece. It was a witness. Across the aisle, Roy Lester sat slumped in a chair that looked too small for his bulk. He was wearing a cheap, off-the-rack suit that smelled of dry cleaning chemicals and desperation. He would not look at me. He just stared at the scarred surface of the defense table, his thick fingers drumming a nervous, irregular beat on the wood. Beside him, Diane looked like she had aged a decade in a week. Her eyes were swollen a muddy red from hours of crying. She wore a frayed gray sweater hunched over, trying to shrink into the shadows of her own cowardice. She was clutching a damp tissue, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a practiced, dramatic flick that made my stomach turn. She was not mourning the loss of her daughter. She was mourning the loss of her safety net. Calloway stood by my side, a gray wolf in a charcoal suit. He did not look at the opposition. He just arranged 3 thick folders on the mahogany podium, the sound of the paper hitting the wood echoing like a sequence of heavy thuds in the silent room. Roy's lawyer, a man named Dunlap, who looked like he had spent his career chasing ambulances through the mud, stood up first. He cleared his throat, the sound a wet rattle. He looked at Judge Harmon, a man with a face like a cracked desert, and began his desperate play. Your Honor, my client Roy Lester has been the sole steward of the property on Maple Ridge for 16 years. Dunlap said, his voice rising with a forced confidence. He has maintained the structure. He has replaced the hot water heater. He has repaired the roof. Under the doctrine of adverse possession, he has established a right of residence through his labor and his consistent maintenance of the home. To throw him out now in the wake of a natural disaster is a violation of his basic rights. Calloway did not wait for Dunlap to sit down. He stepped forward, his boots making a sharp, rhythmic clack on the linoleum floor. Your Honor, the defense is confusing maintenance with money laundering. Calloway said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He flipped open the second folder. Mr. Lester did indeed paint the fence. He did indeed replace a few shingles. But he did so using $83,400 stolen from the life insurance policy of the late Nathan Duke. We have the bank records. We have the forged signatures. Mr. Lester did not build a home. He spent his victims' blood money to maintain a stolen base of operations. He's not a caretaker. He's a looter. Dunlap tried to object, his face turning a dark, bruised purple, but Judge Harmon silenced him with a single, icy stare. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Roy. Calloway did not stop. He pulled a single notarized sheet of paper from the final folder. Finally, Your Honor, we address the Duke Family Trust. Calloway said, his words hitting the room like a series of hammer strikes. The trust mandates that the residency of Diane Duke Lester is contingent upon one condition: she must not engage in any conduct that endangers the safety or well-being of the primary beneficiary, Captain Lisa Duke. I have here a sworn affidavit from Mrs. Meredith Vance, the next-door neighbor. Calloway read the words slowly, letting each one bleed into the silence. On the night of Storm Moran, Diane Duke Lester knowingly and purposefully locked her daughter, a combat veteran, out of the family home during a Category 4 hurricane. She watched from the window as her daughter stood barefoot in the mud while the wind ripped the very shingles off the roof. She chose to lock the deadbolt to protect Roy Lester's comfort over her daughter's life. Diane let out a loud shuddering sob, burying her face in her hands. It was a hollow sound. It was the sound of a woman who had realized the door was finally locked on her, too. I looked at the side of her head. I felt nothing. No anger, no pity. Just the cold clinical satisfaction of a mission reaching its objective. Judge Harmon took the papers. He did not look at Roy. He did not look at Diane. He just flipped through the pages, the sound of the paper rasping like dry leaves. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the clock on the wall. 4 minutes. That was all it took for 16 years of lies to evaporate under the weight of the truth. The judge looked up. His face was a mask of cold stone. The motion for a stay of execution is denied. Harmon said, his voice echoing through the chamber. The evidence of fraud and the violation of the trust conditions are absolute. The defendant's claims of adverse possession are rejected. This property belongs to the Duke Family Trust and Captain Lisi. Duke is its rightful steward. The eviction order is effective immediately. Mr. Lester, you and your wife have 48 hours to vacate the premises. Do not return. Roy's mouth hung open. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and realized there was no ground beneath him. He tried to speak, to beg, but no sound came out. Judge Harmon did not wait. He grabbed the heavy wooden gavel. Crack! The sound was a gunshot. Crack! The sound was the end of the world. Court is adjourned, the judge said. I stood up. I did not smirk. I did not celebrate. I just adjusted my father's watch and looked at the orange eviction notice sitting on Calloway's desk. The fortress had been reclaimed. The enemies were retreating, and I was just getting started. I walked out of the courtroom, my heels clicking a steady victory march on the hard floor. Outside, the sky was a pale, clear blue. The storm was gone. Now it was time to watch them pack. The screech of packing tape was the only sound on Maple Ridge Road that afternoon. It was a dry, aggressive sound, the kind that bites into the silence and leaves a mark. A beat-up orange and white rental truck sat hunched in the driveway of number 42. Its rear door yawning open like a hungry mouth. The weak autumn sunlight hit the white picket fence, highlighting the spots where the paint had curled and dyed, flakes of it drifting onto the dead grass. Roy Lester was lugging a heavy cardboard box, his face a dark shade of bruised purple. He was sweating through a gray t-shirt that had seen better decades, his breath coming in ragged, angry hitches. He tossed the box into the back of the truck with a hollow thud. It was mostly junk, old magazines, rusted tools he didn't know how to use, and clothes that smelled like a basement. 16 years of squatting, and this was all he had to show for it. A pile of cardboard and a rented engine. I stood across the yard, leaning my shoulder against the rough, scarred bark of the old oak tree. I kept my arms crossed over my chest, my fingers brushing the heavy wool of my uniform jacket. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. In the military, you learn that silence is a perimeter. It tells people exactly where they aren't allowed to go. I watched him work. I watched the way his hands shook as he reached for the next load. He looked smaller in the open air, stripped of the walls he'd stolen. Behind the lace curtains of the houses across the street, the neighbors were watching. I could see the slight twitch of the fabric, the silhouettes of people who had spent months calling me a traitor on the town's Facebook group. They had cheered when Roy locked that door. They had brought him casseroles while I was sleeping in a motel. Now they were as quiet as the graves. Not one of them came out to help him lift a box. Not one of them offered a hand as he struggled with the weight of his own failure. They were fair-weather fans of a sinking ship. Calloway had called me the night before to finalize the paperwork. The victory in court wasn't just about the deed. It was a total financial execution. Because of the fraud, Roy's current wages from the construction site were being garnished. Every paycheck he earned for the next 7 years would have a massive chunk ripped out of it before it ever touched his greasy hands. He was going to work himself to the bone just to pay back the $83,400 he'd bled from my father's life insurance. He wasn't just leaving my house. He was entering a prison made of debt. Roy stopped for a second, wiping grease and sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He caught my eye for a fleeting moment. I didn't smirk. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I just stood there, a stone wall in the middle of his chaos. He looked away first, his boots scuffing the concrete as he retreated back into the house for the last of it. Diane appeared in the doorway, then clutching a small taped-up box as if it were a holy relic. She looked fragile, her hair a mess, her eyes sunken into her head. She didn't look at Roy. She didn't look at the truck. She walked down the steps, her movements stiff and slow until she was standing on the sidewalk directly in front of me. She stopped. The air between us was cold thick with the weight of 16 years of betrayal. She looked at the silver bars on my shoulders, then up at my face. She was searching for a crack, a sliver of the little girl who used to beg for her approval. She didn't find it. "Your father would be so proud of you, Lisa," she said. Her voice was thin, a hollow attempt at a weaponized compliment. It was the same old tune, the same tired manipulation she'd used to keep me in line for years. She was trying to use a dead man to bridge a gap she had burned down herself. I looked her straight in the eye. My heartbeat didn't skip. My jaw didn't tighten. I had processed my grief in the mud, and there was nothing left for her to touch. "My father has been proud of me for a long time," I said. My voice was steady, a flat line of absolute certainty. "He was proud when I graduated. He was proud when I earned my commission. He didn't need to see you lose everything to know who I am. He already knew." Diane flinched as if I'd slapped her. Her mouth opened, then shut. She realized the silver bars weren't just for show. I had built a new family, a new life, and she wasn't part of the manifest. She was just a civilian who had violated the rules of engagement. She turned without another word and climbed into the passenger seat of Roy's rusted F-150. Roy got behind the wheel, slammed the door, and cranked the engine. It sputtered, coughing out a thick cloud of acrid black exhaust that hung in the still evening air. He shoved the truck into gear and pulled away from the curb, the tires kicking up a few loose stones. I watched the taillights fade as they turned the corner, heading toward whatever cheap apartment would take them in. The street fell into a heavy, expectant silence. The no-contact order was now a physical reality. The perimeter was secure. The enemies had retreated across the border, and the house, my father's house, was finally quiet. I stayed by the tree for a few more minutes, watching the shadows lengthen across the porch. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, familiar metal of the house keys. They were mine now. No more locks I couldn't open. No more deadbolts standing between me and my life. I walked toward the front door, my boots firm on the stairs. I didn't look back at the street. I didn't look at the neighbors. I just reached for the handle. The war was over. The cleansing was about to begin. The sun pulled itself over the Pine Ridge by 8 a.m., casting long, sharp shadows across the gravel driveway of 42 Maple Ridge Road. The air was crisp, smelling of pine needles and damp earth, a clean break from the humid rot of the storm. I didn't wear the uniform today. I wore an olive drab army undershirt, faded jeans, and leather work gloves that had seen 3 deployments. My spine felt like a steel rod, a habit of 20 years that no amount of civilian life could break. I didn't feel tired. I felt focused, task-oriented. In front of me sat a 5-gallon bucket of Harbor blue paint. It was a deep, dark shade, the color of the Atlantic just before a squall hits. It was the exact code my father, Nathan Duke, had used when he built this fence 25 years ago. Roy had covered it in a flat, chalky white, a cheap, thin coat that looked like a lie. I dipped the brush. The bristles were stiff. I dragged the first stroke across the top rail. The blue was thick. It swallowed the white in one pass, burying Roy's maintenance under a layer of reality. It was a slow, rhythmic labor. Each stroke was a tactical maneuver. I scraped away the peeling flakes of Roy's failure, letting them fall into the dirt like dead skin. My shoulders burned, but it was a good burn. It was the kind of pain you chose. It was the blue-collar therapy they never talked about in the VA clinics. You do not talk your way out of a betrayal. You work your way out. You build something better over the ruins of the old. I watched the paint dry, watching the Harbor blue reclaim the grain of the wood, deep and permanent. Roy had treated this place like a stage for his ego. To me, it was a fortification. "Looks a hell of a lot better already, Lisa," a voice crackled from the sidewalk. I did not startle. I had tracked Mrs. Meredith the moment she stepped off her porch. She was carrying a glass pitcher, sweating with condensation. She walked with a slight limp, her eyes narrowed against the morning glare. She did not mention the sirens. She did not ask where Diane was. She just set a glass of ice-cold lemonade on the fence post. It smelled of fresh lemons and sugar. Nathan spent 3 weeks on that fence. She said, her voice soft but steady. He used a level on every single slat. He would be glad to see the harbor blue back where it belongs. She did not wait for a thank you. She just patted the wood and walked back toward her house. I took a sip of the lemonade. It was tart, sharp, and real. The order of the neighborhood was returning. The chaos of the last 16 years was being filed away under resolved. I was not just painting a fence. I was re-establishing the perimeter of the Duke family. By noon, my shirt was stained with blue, and my hands were cramped. I walked into the kitchen, empty, echoing and smelling of lemon oil, and pulled my phone from my pocket. I dialed Calloway. "It is done," I said when he picked up. "The eviction?" he asked. "That was yesterday," I replied. "I want to set up an automatic wire transfer, effective immediately, every month. 40% of my captain's pay goes into the Vivian Duke Trust." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Calloway's heavy breathing, the rustle of a file. "Lisa, your grandmother does not want your money. She wanted to give you the house. It is a gift." "I do not take gifts from the people I protect," I said, my voice hardening into a command. "I am not a charity case. I am not the girl who got locked out in the rain anymore. I buy back my own history. Every shingle, every nail. I pay for it with my own blood and my own time. Set it up." "Understood, Captain," Calloway muttered. I hung up and felt a weight lift off my chest that the court order had not touched. Ownership was not a piece of paper signed by a judge. Ownership was a debt paid in full. I did not owe Vivian. I did not owe Diane. And I sure as hell did not owe Roy. I was a self-made woman in a house built by a self-made man. I looked at the kitchen counter, clear of Roy's beer cans and Diane's stacks of overdue bills. I had wiped the surfaces until the granite shone like a blade. Night fell over Maple Ridge, bringing a cool breeze from the bay. The smell of salt was heavy in the air. I sat on the top step of the porch, my back against the door that Diane had locked against me. The house was dark behind me, but for the first time in 16 years, the darkness did not feel like a threat. It felt like a rest. I pulled my father's pocket watch from my pocket and laid it on the wooden step beside me. The glass was still cracked, a jagged map of the night I had almost died. But the sound was perfect. Tick, tick, tick. It was the heartbeat of the house. It was the pulse of a legacy that had not been broken, only delayed. I looked out at the street. The harbor blue fence was a shadow in the moonlight, a dark solid line that marked where the world ended and my life began. Roy and Diane were gone, drifting toward some cheap neon-lit fate they had chosen for themselves. They had fired their shots and missed. I reached out and touched the fresh dry paint on the door frame. My hands were steady. My eyes were clear. I was not a victim. I was not a survivor. I was the sentry. And I was finally on my post. I looked at the driveway, waiting for a shadow that would never come. I picked up the watch and closed my fist around it, the ticking vibrating against my palm like a countdown to a silence I had finally earned.